Now, understanding error messages is a crucial skill, but it's not the only thing you should be able to do as a developer. And to show you another helpful feature that you can use for debugging your app and for finding error sources, I'll move on and restart this quiz, because as shown earlier, if I go through it again, I now get an error again suddenly. A different error this time, affecting the entire screen, and also a different error message, but still an error. So what's the problem here? Well, of course, you could and typically should also again take a look at the error message here, also in the debug console. This time there is no error message at the bottom, but as mentioned, if you scroll to the top of this stack trace, you find an error message here. And here we seem to have a problem with using an index in a list, most likely, where we try to use an index, 6 in this case, in a list where we only have indexes 0 to 5. So we seem to access a list item that simply doesn't exist. And of course, again, we learn which part of our code is related to this error. We see that it seems to be related to an array, which in the end is simply a list. But then we also learn that it seems to be stemming from the build method in the questions screen state class. And again, we can click this link to be taken to that code file and to that line of code to find out where this error is originating from. But of course, we could now think about this app again and manually go through all the code again. But instead, I want to show you another feature here. I want to show you how you can run your apps in debug mode and how you can use certain debugging features. Now, to use that debug mode, you first of all should stop the running app and then restart it, but this time by starting it with debugging, so by using the start debugging option. Alternatively, you can go to the main Dart file and there click on debug. This starts the app not just in development mode, but in debugging mode, which unlocks some extra features that make the app a bit slower, but help you as a developer with analyzing the app whilst it runs. So it's not the mode you should use as a default for running the app, since it will slow the app down, but it is a great mode for getting access to some extra features that can help with tracking down errors. So here the app started again, and you can use it as before, but now with debugging mode started, you can do one special thing. You can add breakpoints in your code. And you do that by going to one of your code files, here for example to the code file and to the line of code that was mentioned in the error message before. And if you then hover to the left of these line numbers, you see this red dot here. If you click on that red dot, you add a so-called breakpoint. And what does this breakpoint do? Well, let me answer a question and show you. As soon as this line of code where I added my breakpoint executes, app execution stops, and I moved back here to my editor, and I can now analyze my code and the values that are currently being used in this code. So the values that are currently stored in properties and variables, for example, at runtime. And app execution is paused, as you can see. It's frozen basically until I continue by clicking this play button here. And this all works despite the start code being compiled to machine code. Flutter does all the heavy lifting of linking the app execution on my device, which happens in machine code, back to my original source code. And that's this extra work that's being done by Flutter behind the scenes in debug mode. Now here I can, for example, hover over values, for example, the current question index property here, to see the value that's currently stored inside of that property. And I can not just hover over current question index, but for example also over questions, and I would see that this is a list with 6 items, and I even see the list indexes here, and I can even expand the individual items to see which values are stored inside of these items. And these features can of course give you very valuable insights into your app at specific points of time whilst the app is running. Now here in this case I'll continue because currently the app is still working, but of course now every time I'm answering a question, this gets paused and I can analyze the current values again. You can also right-click on a property or variable and add it to watch so that it is added here to the left in this watch window. And now you will always see this variable or property with its latest value without even hovering over it. So if I now continue and answer another question, I see the updated value here without even hovering over current question index. So this can be very convenient if you know that a specific value should be tracked and you want to quickly see what's inside of that value. Here, for example, I now see that I have an index of 5 and I do have 6 questions with the last question having an index of 5. So accessing this question should still work, but if the current question index would thereafter increase to 6, we would probably get an error. By the way, here you don't just see the watch window on the left, but you also have some generally available variables here. For example, this refers to the entire questions screen state object. And you could dive deeper into some internal properties here, many of those properties being managed by Flutter. And context is this extra object which I mentioned before, which we will use in the next section and which we can ignore for now. You also see the current call stack here, which simply allows you to find out which methods have all been called under the hood up to this point where this breakpoint was reached to get the app to where it is right now. But all that doesn't help us right now, so here I'll just continue. And I'll now go to the results screen and restart the quiz. Now it pauses again, and now we can indeed see that the current question index is reset to 0 here. So this seems to work correctly, so indeed the error seems not to be related to the current question index being too high, at least not right now. Here it was reset as expected. So we can continue a couple of times, and since I know that the error won't occur until I reach the results screen again, I'll also disable the breakpoint again by clicking on it again and by resuming, and then answering all those questions except for the last one, because I know that thereafter I'll get my error. Here I'll reintroduce my breakpoint and then click an answer, and now it pauses again, and here I now see that suddenly current question index is 6, even though it was reset before. And this is of course the reason for this error we're getting, because we only have 6 questions where the last question has an index of 5. So trying to access a question with the index 6 will simply fail because there is no such item in that list. And that's why we're getting this error which we get thereafter. And if an error occurs, as it is the case here, it will actually automatically pause the app, even if there wouldn't be a breakpoint at the point of time where the error occurs. But of course, thus far we haven't learned anything new, or of course not too many new things. We just know that we got an index that is too high, but we need to find out why it is too high. And for that we should take a look at the rest of this class here. There we can see that we're initializing the index here, and we're incrementing it whenever a question is answered. Indeed, there is no code in this entire class here that would ever reset the question index back to 0. We only do that when this class is instantiated for the first time. So the problem here indeed seems to be that we never leave this class, that we stay in this class. And that normally should not be the case. If we switch back here to the Explorer and then take a look at the quiz.dart file, we of course can see that in there we normally should leave the questions screen and navigate to the results screen as soon as we have as many answers as we have questions. So it seems to be this navigation that's broken here, because the problem seems to be that we're staying on this questions screen for too long. We're staying on this screen until we reach a current question index that is too high. That's the problem, and so therefore the actual problem seems to be that we never leave this questions screen. And since this seems to be the problem, it probably makes most sense to restart this app and to again go back through that quiz once and then another time, almost to the point where we get this error, But now here, before we get this error, I want to add some breakpoints here in QuizDart. And I want to add a breakpoint here in choose_answer, because that code is executed whenever we choose an answer. Here in questions screen, we are calling onSelectAnswer, which in the end is a function, which in the end is that function defined here in QuizDart. And I want to take a look at choose_answer to find out if there is something wrong with this condition, which should normally take us away from the questions screen. In addition, I'll add a breakpoint in the build method here to find out which widget we're actually displaying, because it seems to be the questions screen in a situation where the questions screen shouldn't be visible anymore. And with that, I'll answer this last question. And now it pauses here in choose_answer. And here we can of course also take a look at the various values we have here. For example, the answer that was selected, and then add selected answers. And here we can see a problem. We got a super long list of selected answers here. And keep in mind that we only had 6 questions, but here we have 11 answers already, and we're about to add another answer. Now, besides resuming, we can also just continue with code execution step by step by using this second button. So now we go through the different parts of this instruction and then to the next line of code. And this can be very useful for walking through your code at runtime step by step. Here I used this feature to finish adding this answer to selected answers, so that indeed thereafter I can confirm that we have 12 answers in there. And since we have only 6 questions, the problem indeed seems to be that we never reset the selected answers list. We never set it back to an empty list after answering all questions for the first time. And for that reason, this condition here will not be met. Because here I'm comparing the length of selected answers, which is 12 in this case, to the length of questions, which is 6. Of course, this is not equal, and therefore, if I step over, we can see that we don't make it into this if block. The code in there was never highlighted, it was never executed, and instead, if I continue here, we see that the next main step thereafter basically is this error that's being thrown. So we can also see that we never reached this breakpoint here in the build method. This build method never re-executed, so the build method of the quiz state class. And this of course is a clear indicator that active screen, this state, was never set. Because if it would have been set with set state, this build method should have executed before any error occurred. But that never happened, and we therefore now know with certainty that we never navigated away from the questions screen, that we indeed still are on that screen, and that the problem seems to be that this condition here was never met, because selected answers wasn't cleared. And indeed that here is the problem. Here in Restart Quiz, we're not setting selected answers back to an empty list when we actually should be doing that. Because here we're going back to the questions screen, we're restarting the quiz, but restarting the quiz also involves resetting the answers. If we're not resetting the answers, this condition here is never met, and we never make it to the results screen. We therefore stay on the questions screen, and there eventually we reach an index that is too high. That's the problem here, and using this debugging tool can make it a bit easier to find this problem and to fix this error. So here, for example, I now know that I could try adding selected answers equal an empty list here in the setState function call of the restart quiz method in the quiz state class. And with that added, we can try restarting the app with or without debugging. And now hopefully we should not be getting this error anymore, because now with help of the debugging tool, we were able to track down the error, or at least the potential error, and we hopefully were able to come up with a fix. So let's see if this works now. If I go through this quiz twice again, first time works as before, but what about the second time? This now also works, because indeed it looks like this was the problem here. And as you saw, the debugging mode can help you analyze your code at runtime, and it can therefore help you find and fix such errors.